Hey there, welcome back. So this will be our last video in this unit, and this video is all about dynamics processors. Now, as the name implies here, a processor is just that. It's not an effect. It's something that we apply to a signal, and we use it to replace the original signal. So we'll have an original signal passing through our dynamics processor, and we use what comes out the other end. So we generally do not use these as sends. We will use these as an insert. So we need to define a couple of things. First of all, what is dynamic range? Now, the dynamic range is the difference between the softest and the loudest part of a recording. So it's the range of amplitude or volume. Now, most instruments in the real world have a pretty wide dynamic range, especially when you look at something like a group of instruments like an entire symphony. Things can go from very, very quiet to very, very loud in a very short amount of time. Our range of hearing goes from 0 dB up to about 140 decibels before our ears completely shut down and we would be suffering from permanent hearing damage. Things start to hurt at around 120 dB. So we've got a pretty big range of dynamics that our ears can perceive. However, our recording mediums don't have that amount of dynamic range. In the earlier days of radio, there was only a dynamic range of about 60 decibels. When we got to higher quality tape recording, our dynamic range increased to about 80 decibels. When digital recording came out and CDs were available, the dynamic range of a recording could go up to about 96 decibels. And with high bit depth, 32-bit floating point or 24-bit recordings, we have a much greater dynamic range, especially internally in our recording software. So we use dynamics processors to control that dynamic range. Now, these are hardware or software devices, and when signal passes through them, they will either squash down that dynamic range or in some cases will make it bigger, but mostly we use it to make the dynamic range of something smaller. Think of it like an automatic fader. Let's say you have a lead vocal, and vocals are one of the things that can have quite a wide dynamic range. So when someone's singing very quietly, we may not be able to hear that very well when we have the volume set right for the loudest part of the song when they were singing. Conversely, if we turn up those soft parts so we can hear them, then the loud part is too loud. So what we would have to do in the past would be use our finger on a mixing board fader and literally turn that up and down through the course of the mix in order to adjust that. Now, a dynamics processor can help us even out and control that dynamic range. So it's a little bit like having an automatic fader. We're going to discuss 4 different types of dynamics processors and talk a little bit about how each one works and what some of the settings for each ones are. The first type we're going to talk about are compressors. These are the most common, and these are used to control a dynamic range to make it smaller than it is on the input stage, so the output stage is compressed. A limiter is sort of an extreme version of a compressor. We have expanders, and what these do is they increase the dynamic range of a signal. Now, this can be useful in a few different ways, and we'll get into that in a minute. And then related to expanders, we have gates. Gates also increase the dynamic range of a signal, but in a more extreme way than an expander does. So let's talk about the first one, compressors. Now, these proportionately, I'll just read this here, reduce the dynamics of a signal that rise above a definable level that we call a threshold. So once the input signal gets louder than a certain point, which we can usually set by a setting called the threshold, then the compressor kicks in and it starts to turn down the output stage. And that's turned down by an amount that is called the ratio. And the ratio controls how much we're going to turn it down. And I'll show you a graph on how that works in just a second. And there it is. So if we don't have any kind of a compressor involved in a signal, if we look at this graph, here on the horizontal axis, we've got our input level, and it starts down here at 0 and it gets louder. And then this graph, the vertical side, shows us our output level. So no compression at all means that there's not going to be any change. If the input level is minus 20 dB, the output level is minus 20 dB. If the input level is minus 10, the output level is minus 10. If it's 0, it's 0. No change. Our ratio is 1 to 1. For every 1 dB of input, we get 1 dB of output. Now, let's apply a little bit of compression. So first of all, we have to set a threshold. Where is the compression going to start happening? So let's, for the sake of argument, say it's set here at minus 20 dB. Now this ratio is pretty gentle. This is a 2 to 1. Now ratios are always expressed with two numbers separated by a colon, and the second number is always going to be a 1. So in a 2 to 1 compressor, for every 2 decibels of increase in the input level, I'm only going to get 1 decibel of increase on the output stage. So for every dB we go over minus 20, we get, every 2 dB we go over minus 20, we only get 1 dB out of the output. So if we had a 6 dB increase, we'd only have a 3 dB output increase once we go beyond the threshold. 2 to 1 is the same ratio as 6 to 3. If we had an input of 10 dB and we had a 2 to 1 ratio, our output would be, I'm waiting for you, 5 dB. 2 to 1. 2 to 1, if we put in 10, the other side's going to be 5. And we can keep increasing that ratio. Here's a 5 to 1. So for every 5 dB of input signal we increase beyond the threshold, we only get 1 dB. So this is how much it's turning it down. And when we take it all the way to the extreme stage, we have what's called limiting, where once the input signal hits the threshold, it will only be increased on the output stage by a very little amount or by nothing. Okay, so what are the settings that we have on a compressor? Well, first of all, we have a knob that allows us, and this is mostly true on most compressors, where we can control the amount of input coming into our compressor. So that just simple control allows us to control how much signal we're going to be compressing. Then we got to set the threshold. Now this is where that volume reduction or the ratio is going to start taking effect. Not all compressors have threshold settings. Sometimes they have a fixed threshold and you use the input gain to determine how much or where the signal is going to start to get compressed. Then we have our ratio. We just talked about that a second ago. So is our ratio pretty gentle, 2 to 1, 3 to 1, or is it a little harder, maybe 6 to 1, or are we limiting something where it's going to be 10 to 1 or higher? Then there are generally a couple of other settings. We have the attack, and this is how quickly the compressor turns the signal down once they exceed the threshold, and this is measured in milliseconds. These are the settings that are most difficult for people to understand when they're working with compressors. Compressors in general are one of the hardest processors to grasp and to really learn how to use well. I've been doing this for over 20 years and I'm still learning tricks about compressors and learning how to use them properly. It takes a while, so practice is your best way to do it, experimentation, but having a basic knowledge of how these things work and what these knobs do will help you get there a lot quicker. So attack, we use that if we want a little bit of the attack transient to sneak through. So let's say we're compressing a snare drum. Now we may want to compress that snare because it's got a lot of dynamic range, but if we start compressing it immediately, we lose that attack of the sound that really defines what it is. So we can set the attack time to be a little bit slower so that the first part of that snare drum sound can sneak through and we can hear it as, oh, that's a snare, but then it gets turned down, usually pretty quickly. And this attack time is going to be dependent upon a lot of different things. It's going to be dependent upon the envelope of the sound itself. It's going to be determined a little bit by the tempo of the track you're working on. And it's also going to be determined by how you want to shape the sound. I might want to squash the attack part of the sound. A good example of that would be a tambourine, where you've just got massive amounts of attack transient and very little of the jingle. So we may want to squash down that first part so we can get more of the jingle and less of the hit. Release is also a very tempo-based kind of thing. Now this is the time that it takes for the compressor to restore or recover from the compression once the original level either falls below the threshold or the input level falls below the output level. Either one of those things are determined by the release time. So let's use another example of a bass guitar. Let's say we need to compress the bass so that we want it to sit in the mix, and the bass player is playing very long notes and it's kind of a slow song. So we would want that release time to be fairly slow so that as soon as the bass player hits the note and it starts to decay, the compressor will open up slowly so the note has a nice, smooth, even release. It doesn't suddenly get louder because it has a quick release time. We call that pumping in a track, and you kind of want to avoid that. So these are the tricky ones, the attack and release, and you really got to tweak with those and think about what the envelope of the original sound is, how it's working in the track, what is the tempo of the track, and do we want to use these to affect the sound? You know, what is it exactly we're trying to do, and we have to take that into account when we set these. Then at the very back end of the compressor, since we're usually using these to turn signals down, the signal may not be loud enough in the mix once it goes through the compressor because we've reduced the output after a certain threshold. So we have to turn a little bit up at the end of the chain, and we call that makeup gain. Makeup gain lets us bring the level of the output back up to a point where we can hear it in the mix, and we don't have to necessarily turn the fader up anymore. We can do that with the makeup gain on the compressor. Now limiting is, I call it compression on steroids. It has a number of different functions. The ratios on limiters are very high. They usually start at 10 to 1 to 100 to 1. It can even say infinity to 1. And these are brick wall compressors. Once the input level hits the threshold, it does not get any louder. That's it. It's a brick wall. And we use limiters both on the input stage and the output stage. If you're recording, let's say you're recording a singer that's just got a crazy dynamic range. They go from a whisper to a scream in seconds. So we can use a limiter to kind of protect the input stage of our recorder and keep those screams from overloading the input and still maintain a relatively healthy amount of signal coming in for the soft parts. On the other side, radio stations use limiters at the very end of the broadcast chain to keep the program material from going above the headroom of their transmitter, which would cause clipping and distortion, which they obviously don't want. So heavy-duty brick wall limiters are used at the end of a broadcast signal in order to keep them from overloading the transmitters. And we use these too in mastering in order to raise the overall average volume of a track. So we increase our overall output by increasing their output level, but preventing them from going beyond, in the case of a digital recording, 0. And in mastering, we use this to pump up the volume. When you limit a track, it allows you to bring up the average level, but not exceed 0. So that makes the track overall seem louder. And for many years, everybody wanted their record to sound louder than anybody else's. So the use of limiting in mastering really got out of hand, where you wouldn't see hardly any dynamic range in a recorded track. That's still the case in some genres of music. I'd say in hip hop and rap in particular, and pop music. They want those tracks to sound really loud and in your face. So limiting is used to just drive the level of the track up to a certain point, and there will be very, very little dynamic range at all. Now, obviously, you wouldn't want that in a jazz recording or a classical recording. And the trend for a lot of mastering engineers is to not quite do that so much, because people you get tired listening to tracks that are just loud all the time. It's nice to have some dynamic range in music. It makes it more expressive and more interesting to listen to. So a lot of mastering engineers are not limiting things to the extent that they have over the last 10 years or so. Now, expanders are the opposite. They take our signal and we, instead of decrease the proportional dynamic range of it, we increase it. And this is done in a couple of different ways. The most common is called downwards expansion. And what we do here is we're decreasing the volume of a signal once it falls below a certain threshold. So that's the opposite of a compressor. Compressor turns it down when it goes above the threshold. An expander turns it down once it goes below the threshold. Now, the other thing an expander can do to increase the dynamic range is to turn a signal up when it goes above the threshold, and we call that upwards expansion. Not used very often at all. So downwards expanders are much more common, and this would be used. Here's an example of what it looks like. So we have a 1-to-1 ratio. It's just like a compressor, but when the threshold is, let's say it's set here, this dotted line, once the signal falls below that threshold, it's going to start getting reduced by a ratio. So for every 1 dB below the threshold on the input stage, the output level would be reduced by 2 dB in the case of a 2-to-1 downwards expander. If we go all the way and say infinity to 1, then we call that gating, and we're going to get into that in just a second. There it is. So gates or noise gates, they're like expanders on steroids. And what they do is they completely reduce the signal once it falls below the threshold. Now, these can sound a little choppy at times, but we do use them, especially in certain circumstances. So we have our input level here. Once the input level falls below a certain point, boom, it drops to 0 and is turned off. So we use gates for different things. One of the things that's very common is, let's say you've got a really noisy guitar amp that buzzes and hums, and when the guitarist is playing, the signal of their guitar through the amp might be so loud that it actually masks all that stuff. But when they're not playing, we don't want to have that hum or that buzz in our track, so we use a gate or a downwards expander. I tend to use downwards expanders because they're not so dramatic, and you don't hear the sound chopping off. Sometimes a gate actually is more noticeable than the buzz you're trying to remove, but it will greatly reduce or completely mute the buzz or hum from a track. We also use them to reduce the bleed on a microphone from other instruments that are in a room. So if you had a group of singers and not everybody was singing at the same time, or maybe you were doing some dialogue and you had a bunch of different actors that were reading together, when someone's not speaking, you're still going to hear the other voices on that microphone, but they're going to be significantly quieter. And if we want to turn that down even more, we can use a downwards expander to do that. I use them a lot on tom-tom mics because tom-toms generally aren't played a whole lot on a track. They're usually used for fills and accents. But a lot of times the mic is just sitting there open and you're getting a great recording of the tom ringing when they're playing, the drummer's playing all the other drums. And also you're picking up the sounds from the other drums. You might be picking up some cymbals, you might be picking up some snare, but it's going to be quite a bit quieter than the tom-tom itself. So we use downwards expanders, or at least I do, to reduce the sound of that ringing tom-tom when that drum isn't actually being played. We can also use them for special effects. We can key a gate with another signal. Now this is called using a sidechain. And if you take some of the advanced classes, you'll be learning about sidechains and how to use them. And an example of this would be creating a stuttering vocal effect where we might feed the vocal track. We'll put the vocal track through a gate, but we won't trigger the gate with the vocal. We'll trigger it with something else, like a hi-hat, for instance. So every time the drummer plays the hi-hat or your MIDI hi-hat track makes a sound, the gate will open up, and then when the hi-hat closes, the gate will close. And if that's being applied to a vocal track, you'll get this rapidly opening and closing effect that matches the hi-hat. And it's a very cool effect, and it can be used in electronic music especially to a really great advantage. So those are our different types of digital signal processing that does dynamics control. So just a quick review, we've got compressors, we've got limiters, we've got expanders, and we've got gates. If you want to learn more, take the advanced classes. Okay, here we are in Cubase, and I'm going to use that same track I used on the Reverbs to show you some uses of dynamics processing. And we'll apply this to, we'll use a snare drum first, and then we'll maybe look at our bass and a lead vocal. So let's take the snare drum first. So I've got the snare drum soloed right now, and we can listen to it. So that's what our snare sounds like. It's got a little bit of reverb on it. So let's open up that by hitting the Edit Channel Settings. And you see I've got a little bit of EQ applied to the reverb, and it's going into this RevX room. I'm going to turn that off. So we're just hearing the snare dry. And let's turn it up a little bit. Now the snares they're dynamic. They go from soft to loud. This player was pretty consistent. There wasn't a whole lot of variation, but you may have a snare drum track where the player is ghosting a lot of notes or maybe whacking it with really hard rim shots, and you've got too much dynamic range. So you want to be able to control the amount of proportionate ratio between soft and loud. So first thing we'll do is we'll just apply a basic compressor on here, and then I'll show you a cool trick that we can use to create an effect that was very popular in the 80s. So we'll go to our Dynamics tab, and here's all of our different types of effects, and we'll select a compressor. So again, this is the compressor that comes with Cubase. So let's just review our settings. We have our threshold amount here. So right now it defaults to -20 dB, and that's that little dot right there. So you can either move that here on the graph, or you can move it here with the knob. And then we've got our ratio, and the ratio is going to be controlled and expressed here. So you see that in a compressor we go from ratio of 1 to 1, and this is showing us this number here is our first number. You're assuming that the second number is a 1. So as I increase that, our max is 8. So beyond 8 to 1, we're looking more at a limiter than a compressor. But let's set a pretty healthy amount, so we'll get about 4.5 there. Then down here we have our makeup. Now, right now it's set to auto, which means that the processor will kind of automatically determine, based on the amount of gain reduction, how much you need to turn that back up. We have our knee. This is a parameter we didn't really discuss, but it's shows us, well, here's a soft knee, there's a hard knee. You can't really see the difference, but it's that angle right there. Is it compressing kind of gradually, or is it happen immediately once the threshold is surpassed? Then we've got our attack and release. We've also got a hold, which means that the compressor will hold open for a certain amount of time before it releases. And then we've got an analysis, and what this allows the compressor to do is kind of determine whether the compression is coming primarily from the peaks of the signal or the average level of the signal. And right now it's set more to the average side. I'm going to bring that more over to the peak side because I want to bring down the peaks of my snare. So let's start playing that. Now I'm compressing it pretty hard. This meter here is showing me my amount of gain reduction. How much is this snare getting turned down? Now let's bypass the compressor and you'll hear the difference. Okay, now it's also, the attack time is very short. What was it, 1 millisecond, now it's 0.1. So it's completely smashing the snare. Now that doesn't sound very realistic, but I can get some pretty cool effects by doing that. Let's take the release time to practically nothing. And let's hold it for a little while. So now I'm hearing all that other stuff, like the snap of the snare and the rattle of the snare that you hear after the initial hit. Compare that to the original sound. So you can really use a compressor as a tone shaper. But let's say I just want to use it more as a way to control the volume of the snare. So first of all, I'm not going to compress it as much. So I'm going to raise my threshold. I'm going to reduce my ratio, so it's not turning it down as much. I'm going to increase my attack time to about 3 or 4 milliseconds. That'll let the attack transient sneak through. I'm not going to put any hold on it. And I'm going to let it release fairly slowly. Relatively slowly. It's still pretty fast. Okay, so now it's not pumping. It's not getting suddenly loud when the compressor releases. So that would be a good setting there just to kind of control the very loudest hits. So you can see that when he's hitting it not as hard, the gain reduction isn't as dramatic. But when there's a really loud hit, that gain reduction is a lot more apparent. Like, let's go over here where we've got a pretty big dynamic range. So that lets me hear those softer ones where it's not really, on those first few hits, not reducing the gain at all. Oops. Zip to the end of the song by mistake. Okay, there we go. And then when it gets to the end of that big fill, then the gain reduction is quite a bit. All right, now let's do, that was a basic application of a compressor on a snare track. Now let's have some fun. So I'm going to change this from a compressor. I'm going to make this a reverb, and I'm going to create an effect called a gated reverb. So I'm going to go to my RevX here and throw away all my compressor settings. And let's make a great big Hall reverb on this snare. Now, we're not using it as a send, so we got to control our dry-wet mix. Okay. That's pretty huge, right? But what I want to do is I want to do this thing called a gated reverb. And the way you do that is you can either, sometimes you have gated reverb effects in your reverb processor where the gate's already there, but I'm going to apply it using a gate. So we'll go to our dynamics processors, and I'm going to find a gate. There's one right there. Let's go back to the top of the song. Okay. Now that gate is way too fast now. So this shows me the threshold. So this is coming after the reverb. So what I want to do is I want to make that reverb chop off very quickly once it falls below a certain threshold. So in order to do that, I need to set my release time to be very short. And let's work with our threshold. There we go. It's not really smooth, so we might have to add a little bit of release time here. And then I want it to hold for a while before it chops off, so let's add some hold time. All right, there you go. Classic 80s gated reverb. Let's see what that sounds like in the drum track. So we'll just put the drums on. Now I could change my hold time in order to make it match the tempo of the song. So I want it to last almost to the next snare drum hit. This is where the tempo part of this comes in. Or I can make it real short. Pretty cool stuff. All right, let's go to our bass track. And instead of a compressor, let's put a gate, or not a gate, but a limiter on our bass. So that bass is not going to get any louder after it reaches a certain point. So I got some stuff in here now I'm going to go ahead and turn off. Some of these are effects that are third party. Okay, so that's what our bass sounds like, just the DI, just the electrically injected signal. And we'll go to Dynamics, and we will choose a limiter. Now notice that this doesn't have a threshold on it, right? That's because I have to tell the, it's a form of compression, I have to increase my input until I hit the threshold. And let's change our release so it's a little faster. So that's without it. So the first thing you should notice is that overall the track sounds louder. Now part of that is because I increased the input level so much, right? So that's one of the main reasons it seems louder. But I'm also increasing the average signal level by quite a bit by saying even the softest parts of the signal are going to get boosted, but the very loudest attack portions of the sound are not going to make it through. They are getting limited, so it'll never get past 0. Even if I crank that thing up as far as it'll go, and maybe even go over here and just turn up my track. So we got something coming up here that's going to be quite loud. And you can see I'm really squashing this signal now. Let's back that off a little. So let's open up that meter again. So when it gets to that break, it's probably going to just about hit 0, but not quite. Almost, you know, probably why is because I don't have it turned up here. So if I set that close to 0, you'll see that my meter is never going to go over 0. So that's an example of limiting on a bass track. Now if we hear that in the mix, well, it's obviously a little too loud. But what this allows me to do is get that bass in the mix at a good level, and it's going to be very consistent. It's always going to be there. I don't have to worry about the bass player suddenly playing soft. It's always going to be very present in the mix. Now that's a bit of an extreme example, but I wanted you to see it. And then finally, let's put a little bit of compression on our lead vocal. So we'll go down here. Now lead vocals, the way I like to set up compressors on lead vocals is, first of all, we're going to turn off all of these goodies here. And we're going to turn this into just a regular compressor. So in order to figure out where the threshold should be set, I kind of look at my track and I look for a quiet spot. Where was she singing kind of quiet? Sort of in here. So I'm going to set a couple of locates here, like there. And then I'm going to get to the end of that quiet part, and I'm going to set another locate. And then let's just go ahead and loop that. So once she's singing real quiet, I'm going to set my threshold so that it's just tapping. I don't want that. I don't want the compressor compressing these real quiet parts. I want it to compress these loud parts. So let's move this threshold until the compressor is just barely tapping. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now, if we zoom over here and choose the louder part too, so that loud, ignore it, got compressed, and this part did not. So instead of having to ride my volume fader, the compressor is doing that job for me. I usually use a fairly fast release time on a vocal, so so I can hear that t at the end of it. The attack's going to happen real fast. And I'm going to increase my ratio. So I'm not changing the threshold, but I'm changing how much the compressor is going to turn the signal down when it gets to those loud parts.
But come on, is this a joke? I try to ignore it. But come
I need a little bit
on,
slower
is
release.
this a joke? I try to ignore it. But come on, is this a joke?
So let's put this vocal in the track and listen to the difference of what happens when we go back to our left locate point and play this without any compression. You'll be able to hear this part here just fine, but you probably won't be able to hear this part very well.
I try to ignore it.
Actually, let's go to a part of the song where we've got a little bit more going on.
I'm alive, but I'm not. And it is empty, and I'm lonely, and my patience here is shot.
Okay, so we heard this stuff fine, but these lines here were just getting buried by the band. So let's turn our compressor on, and it's automatically going to make up the gain for us. And now notice how these quiet passages are going to be able to be heard much better, and the loud parts are getting turned down a little bit, so they're not going to seem too loud when we get to them.
I'm alive, but I'm not. And it is empty, and I'm lonely, and my patience here is shot.
All right, so that's how you would use a compressor on a vocal track. I hope that helps explain some of the concepts that I presented in the first part of the video. That's it for this unit, so good luck on the quiz, and we'll see you for week 10.